welcome back. You are watching and listening to Breakfast with Ellie and Nicholas.
And now let's take a look at today's front pages. The Mail leads on Prince Harry, how unsurprising, who says that his brother William told him therapy had brainwashed him.
The Telegraph says the Duke of Sussex revealed he couldn't cry in public when his mother died.
The Mirror has an exclusive interview with the former head of the Navy, who's warned that the Invictus Games athletes have been made a target because of what Prince Harry has been saying.
Meanwhile, the Times reports the NHS will buy up beds in care homes to make room in A&E hospital wards.
And the Observer claims that the NHS is offering fast and easy private healthcare services to queue jumpers.
Well, time to go through the papers now, and joining us this morning is editor of Spite, Tom Slater, and anthropologist Marianne Hotter. Good morning to both of you. Marianne, as we saw, NHS and Prince Harry seem to be dominating the papers this morning, but let's start with the NHS, shall we? Ahead of the biggest nursing strikes, we're told, in January. This is in the Independent, Rishi Sunak calling for bold and radical action to fix the NHS.
Yes, apparently sorting out the health and social care crisis, the ambulance waiting times, the urgency to free up hospital beds is a collective responsibility, which is nice that he's joined the party, perhaps a little late, because the collective responsibility means that he also needs to be at the table sorting this out on account of him being the Prime Minister. But this is, so the head of the Royal College of Nursing has said, well, yeah, that's great. I'd like to invite you to come and do a 14-hour shift with our nurses in an emergency department. And also, you know, actually come to the table and establish what the terms are for settling this, because there's no way to meet the waiting list targets without addressing pay. And I suspect that the government have perhaps misjudged public sentiment on this, because often when strikes stay around rail workers who are perceived to be very well paid, you know, they're kind of easily striking, and it's all those train drivers who are on six-figure salaries, neither of which are accurate, but that's the kind of perhaps the perception if you're feeling uncharitable. But of course now strikes, we're effectively in a sort of general strike season, aren't we? And I think there's probably been a misstep in terms of appreciating how much public support there is for this, how much people are genuinely worried, and that those kind of one-off stories about, you know, someone's relative having a terrible time in A&E despite the best efforts of all the NHS staff, or dying on the forecourt of a hospital because they're still in the ambulance. That's happening to more and more people. Yeah. More and more people have that very close relationship with someone who has undergone that, or a family who's undergone that traumatic experience, and it really brings it home.
But it's disentangling two things, important things though, isn't it? The pay rises thing is the sort of immediate, but what people like the Prime Minister, as politicians so often do, is talk about the need for radical change, which is a much more longer term and much more fundamental thing, isn't it?
It is, and you know, these kind of euphemistic phrases, radical change or long-lasting vision, what do you actually mean? Because radical change in the NHS is diverting people who don't need to be in hospital from ever getting to hospital, and it's about getting people who are in hospital who don't need to be there anymore, getting them out. And fundamentally, that kind of radical change requires wholesale commitment from the government to sort out health and social care.
Indeed. Right, on we go.
Tom, let's have a look at Prince Harry, shall we, who's dominating the headlines for, I think, the third or fourth day this week. This is an Express.
Third or fourth week,
Well, it's true. Third or fourth year, maybe, yeah, but especially this week, we're in overdrive, aren't we? Tom, let's look at the Express, shall we? The security experts warning Prince Harry he's put himself and his family at risk.
Yes, one of the great ironies of this story, I suppose, is the fact that when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle left the UK, and there was a lot of concerns about, you know, are they going to still be in receipt of certain amounts of royal money? Because they were concerned about their security. It costs a lot to have the sort of security that they need. But in the wake of his comments, particularly, you know, giving his number, as it were, the number of Afghan insurgents who he'd actually killed whilst he was serving in the military over there. This will have made him, according to security experts, kind of in the top kind of tier security targets, if you like, in the world around with kind of, former US presidents and so on. And so the cost of the security could be as much as 5.5 million a year, analysts believe now. And just again, kind of underlying how that in the kind of midst of his desire to sort of open up and tell the world his story and all about himself, there hasn't been a level of care, partly with how maybe the story might have landed with certain constituencies, but even just on a kind of personal security level, this is something which has apparently seriously endangered his own family as a consequence of this sort of loose talk.
The strange thing is, I mean, did he just sort of sit down with an author and say, here, this is what I want to be put in this book, or did somebody advise him? Did nobody say to him, hang on a minute, sir, is that really a good idea? We just don't know.
Well, you do
bizarre,
wonder,
isn't it?
It is very strange, because these are the sorts of things that, someone would have a look at this before it would go out. So there would be not just, Harry reading over the proofs himself to make sure this is what he likes, but also, advisors, people around you. And I guess that's also one of the consequences is when you leave the kind of royal infrastructure where anything like a book like this wouldn't appear, of course, but you have a lot of advice around you, shall we say, to probably being in a situation where you don't necessarily have that same sort of infrastructure as a whole new world for him. Maybe that just makes these things more likely. But for whatever the reason, it is remarkable how many kind of missteps on a personal, or in this case a security level, he seems to have made with this particular.
What do you think of the school of thought, Tom, that this was all intentional in order to increase the threat level against him and therefore increase his security? Because this is something he feels very passionate about. We've heard him talk about a lot, security for himself and his family. Do you think it was intentional, or do you think it's head of the Royal Navy speaking today in the Mirror saying it's just very stupid?
I think it is just very stupid, really. I think part of the problem with Prince Harry is that, there's a lot of kind of theories as to why he's kind of saying the things that he's saying. Is he doing it for those reasons? Is he doing it for fame? Is he doing it for fortune or whatever? I think the thing is he just genuinely does seem to think he's kind of imbibed a kind of quite sort of therapeutic sort of ethos and needs to open up about everything, but you can't open up about everything, particularly when you're a kind of top tier security target.
And maybe not to the whole world.
Yeah, certainly a few things I would rather not know about Harry. Listen, Marianne, let's go back. Let's go back to another completely different, and this is a new line entirely. Sunday Mirror, inside, but a very important story about resigning ministers who can do extremely well.
Yes, so as you'll remember, that big fiasco in the autumn where ministers were in post for sometimes a matter of days before they got sacked or resigned or stood down, or then there was a new prime minister, or there were a new, government, all the rest of it.
I can't even remember her name now.
No, exactly, that one. So someone's crunched the numbers and worked out that these, so you get a severance payment if you resign or if you're sacked as a minister, and it's a proportion of what would have been your annual salary for fulfilling that role. Now, you're entitled to that payment even if you were doing the job for 4 days. And Labour have worked out that the total bill for those ministers who were put in post and then removed in that period of Liz Truss turmoil could amount to as much as £720,000, and that's taxpayers' money. So it's us paying them for the chaos. Don't forget the billions of pounds that were wiped off, the kind of value of the economy, the debt that has been saddled onto the country. Put that to one side, or the costs of people's mortgages, all that stuff. Now, some ministers have said, I'm not going to take that payment. So the most high-profile person who's explicitly said that already is Gavin Williamson, who was in role for 14 days. But lots of about 70 ministers, 32 in the cabinet, stood down. So they would all officially be entitled to this severance pay. So the kind of the call is that we need to put pressure on to make sure that ministers do not claim for this money. Well, they go, well, I'm entitled for it. Not really. That was not in the public or the country's best interest. It would pay for how many?
They've got equivalents.
Or they've got an equivalent. Hang on, how many? Well, there's how many? So 24,000 young persons rail cards. There was a thing about how many free school meals. I can't find it now.
But
sorry.
It's interesting. On another day, you have to say, without Prince Harry and things, I mean, that is a really,
it's a huge story.
Going to make people cross, to put it mildly.
Yes, but I think this ship hasn't sailed because these payouts haven't yet been made.
Right.
So if your MP was involved in that, Send them a message.
Yeah.
Tell them exactly what you think and that what you think the right thing to do is.
I don't think enough is known about severance payments because they are just so expensive, really. It's extraordinary, isn't it? The ministers really do come and go. They can just have weeks or months at a time in a job, but they could be paid so very much for their time. The Truss and Kwarteng affair was very costly, wasn't it, Tom?
It was on so many different levels. I think that also there's a kind of political impact of it because, what the kind of project they embarked upon was obviously very ill-fated and very stupidly thought out and so on. And I was never a kind of believer in this sort of Singapore-on-Thames sort of model of the economy that they wanted to do. But at the same time, one thing that politically I think is quite unfortunate is it's created this idea that if you try anything a bit radical, a bit outside the status quo, then everything's going to go to hell in a handcart. You just have to listen to what the markets and the Bank of England say, and that's it. And I think both, in their own different ways, both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are kind of now kind of quite obviously saying we're going to keep within the kind of narrow bounds of the orthodoxy, which I don't think is a good thing either, unfortunately.
Don't need any more nasty shocks. OK, right. Tom, you've got another story from the Telegraph. This is a very different side of the coin, isn't it? A strange business about, if I got this right, a very small rise in your pay can actually lose you an enormous amount of money. Explain what that's about.
So it's unpicking some of the kind of, I suppose, perverse incentives in the system currently for when people earn over a certain amount because of, particularly if you've got children. So the example that they're using is not necessarily going to be a typical example, shall we say, because people who earn over £100,000 a year, which is obviously a very small portion of the population, but still, if they were in a situation where they had 3 children and they've had even a kind of £1 pay rise, it would be within their interest to turn that down, but because of all the different, because of tax and because of the benefits they might lose and so on and so forth, then that wouldn't necessarily be worth it. So as I say, this applies to people earning over 100k. People might be reaching for their very small violins at this particular point, but at the same time, for the Conservatives, this is a concern because there is that narrative about themselves about we are the party of aspiration and so on has been sort of clobbered a bit because of the fact that they have become such a high tax and high spending party from the perspective of their own base. So this, I think, reflecting that kind of concern from a right-leaning newspaper.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a random one because there's always going to be a threshold for whether you're entitled to a given benefit or not. And the point at which you just tick over, you're not entitled anymore. And so the kind of £1 versus £14,000 worth of childcare is pretty stark. But I don't know, I think it's an interesting strategy of the Telegraph to run that kind of story because actually a lot of the focus for benefits is about people who are in low-wage jobs, where ticking over a threshold suddenly means that you're not entitled to carer's allowance, but you still have care responsibilities. Those are the things that make real, meaningful difference to people's quality of life, and literally whether they're choosing to buy sanitary products or breakfast that day. And I think, the Telegraph are perhaps trying to make it relevant to their constituency, which is a bit interesting. Telling.
Yeah. Well, anyway, loads in the papers, and we'll be hearing, I think, from you a bit later as well.
Lots more to
Marianne
come.
and Tom, thanks
you.
very much indeed.
Thank you.
Excellent.